solve large, intractable problems.
It's a new venture altogether.
Your brain is a wild horse there.
Because remember, writing is not a team sport.
You are not selling horse carriages when there are cars.
I want to be known only as the trusted advisor.
More like a tourist.
Play to Potential podcast.
In the book, I talk about strategic patience, and strategic patience is kind of my antidote to regular patience, which I just don't really like at all because it seems so passive. But for strategic patience, you understand that things are going to take longer than you want. You don't necessarily like it. You don't have to like it, but it might take longer than you want. But you're doing things, you're taking action, you're coming up with hypotheses, you're testing things, you're adjusting it. You're not just like waiting, like, oh, maybe something will happen, right? And so waiting for the raindrops and looking for the raindrops is really powerful, because I think where a lot of people go wrong is they get so fixated on the final outcome, which in our metaphor here, we can call the thunderstorm. And that's like, oh, well, it's a New York Times bestseller. Or, oh, well, you get to be the keynote speaker at the huge conference. Those things really take a while. And it's very easy for us, if that's all we're fixated on, to sort of talk down or to negate some of the smaller victories. It's like, you start to, you go from nowhere and then you start to get invited on a couple of podcasts. Well, but nobody listens to those podcasts. Yeah, but okay, it doesn't have to be Oprah. It's that you went from nobody knowing who you were to a couple of random people knowing who you are. That's actually progress. Like, I know you want it to be bigger and faster and better, but to understand that to have anybody calling you up and asking you to be on their show, that is a victory. And we need to understand it as such and not get snooty about it, but instead to really appreciate, okay, this is what it looks like to make progress. This is what it looks like to be getting there. I think that's powerful.
Hello, listeners. Happy New Year and welcome to the 85th conversation at the Play to Potential podcast. I'm your host, Deepak Jayaraman. And as you know, this podcast is a labor of love for the long term, where I have conversations with leading practitioners, thinkers, authors, artists, sportsmen, and other leading professionals to decode insights around leadership, transitions, and careers. In addition to curating this podcast, I work with leaders with a growth mindset as a trusted sounding board, helping them and their organizations transform and play to their unique potential. To know more about what's in the podcast archives and the advisory work I do, you could just visit playtopotential.com. That's playtopotential.com. Towards the end of 2021, I wrote about 10 articles synthesizing some of the key insights I picked up in the year and connected it to some of the learnings from the podcast archives. If you're interested, you can just find that on my LinkedIn profile in the article section. Now to the guest of this podcast. It's Dorie Clark. Dorie has recently authored the book, The Long Game: How to Be a Long-Term Thinker in a Short-Term World. Now, if you've been a regular at the podcast, you will appreciate that this topic is an area of personal curiosity and something I've explored with various guests in the past. As we kick off 2022, I thought this would be a good theme to set the tone for the year ahead. Without further ado, let's see how the long game is played with Dorie Clark. Dorie, thanks for making the time. Excited to have you at the Play to Potential podcast.
Thank you, Deepak. I'm so glad to be here with you.
During this podcast, we talk about people's journeys and choices and transitions. So before we talk about your recently published book, The Long Game, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your journey. Talk to us about some of the key choices that got you to what you do now, and maybe give us a sense of why you wrote the book, and then we'll dive into the book.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. There's a lot of places that one can start in one's journey, but broadly speaking, I grew up in a small town in North Carolina, really wanted to get out of that small town. So I went to college early, and I ended up going to college at 14 and then graduating when I was 18. I went then to Harvard Divinity School and got a master's degree in Theological Studies. And when I got out of school, I started trying to find my way in the world. And like a lot of people, I managed to hit a variety of career roadblocks. I first tried to get into a doctoral program after I had finished my master's degree and got turned down by all the programs that I applied for. So I then decided I'd become a journalist. And I did that for about a year, and then I got laid off. So I had to come up with something else. It was very hard to get another job in journalism because the industry was kind of contracting. So I had been a political reporter, and I then ended up working in politics for a variety of candidates who kept losing. So it was a windy path to entrepreneurship for me. But for the past 15 years, I've had my own business, and that has entailed a lot of facets, including teaching now at Duke and Columbia, and speaking, writing books, and a variety of other activities like coaching and consulting. But broadly speaking, the way that I think about my work, having begun my career really at the intersection of marketing and communications and strategy, is helping people and organizations figure out how to get their message heard and their best ideas heard in a very crowded and noisy world.
And if I may persist with this theme, Dorie, if you go back 15 years, theology, journalism, political writer, how did you stumble upon this path? Could you talk to us about just the origin story of your journey, 15-year journey?
The original insight that I had that brought me to entrepreneurship, I had never really thought about that as a career for myself, but the most immediate preceding activity before starting my own business was, for 2 years, I was a nonprofit executive director. And I was always interested in advocacy and social causes and things like that, which is why I had gotten into journalism and why I had gotten into politics. And I worked for this small organization, which was actually a bicycle advocacy organization. And about a year into it, I suddenly had this realization that running this nonprofit was basically like running a small business. It was almost indistinguishable. I mean, of course, you roll the profits back into the organization, but you still have to run it the same way. And I thought, oh, wait, I've somehow been, inadvertently learning how to run a small business. And then I thought, well, I could do that for myself. And suddenly I realized that this whole new opportunity was in front of me that I hadn't considered before. And I realized that might be a good direction to go in.
Lovely. And coming to the present, Dorie, give us a sense of you've written quite a few books now, and The Long Game is a recent. Give us a sense of the arc of your curiosity and maybe a little bit of context around why you chose to write this book, The Long Game.
So the books that I've written in many ways have reflected some of the journeys that I've been on and some of the topics that I've been wanting to understand. My early training as a journalist was helpful in the sense that in a lot of ways, it gave me a framework to understand the world. If you have questions, well, how do you solve them? Well, you go talk to people, you go interview people, and you synthesize the results. And so for me, a lot of my books have been about trying to solve puzzles for myself and hopefully wanting to be helpful to others as well by putting the information together and curating it and collating it and hopefully enabling things to be a little easier for them to find access to that information. So my first book was called Reinventing You, and it in many ways reflects some of the early career journeys that I had, where I had to reinvent myself a number of times. I felt like I was kind of flying blind. I didn't really know what I was doing exactly. And I really wanted to find a way that I could talk to other people who had reinvented themselves in maybe a better way, a faster and more efficient way. So I could share that with others, because it can be such a destabilizing thing if you're trying to change careers or if you have to change careers. I then went on to write Stand Out, which was reflected my fascination with understanding how to become a recognized expert in your company or in your field. I had started my business, and I knew that it was really essential in order to be able to succeed to carve out a niche in the marketplace and really be seen as an expert. And I wanted to understand how to do it. Then my most recent book before the latest one was Entrepreneurial You, which was essentially how do you monetize successfully. I came to realize a lot of times we assume that professional success and monetary success go together, that they're intrinsically linked. But so often now in our society, they have been decoupled, and you actually have to have a separate monetization strategy as compared to your brand and platform building strategy. So I wanted to go into that and really understand, how do you make money once you, once you are successful, once you do know what you're doing, how do you actually make money off of it? And then finally, the most recent book is The Long Game. And I wrote that because for the past 5 years, I have run an online community called Recognized Expert, which is for professionals that are looking to really just make a bigger impact, to get their ideas heard. I have a number of course participants from India, and also Indian Americans as well. And what I saw, because 600 plus people have been through this program, I began to see patterns in things that were just places where people got stuck or they got held up in terms of the quest to put themselves out there and have their ideas heard. And I wanted to really create a framework to help good people understand how and where they could persevere in order to be able to really slog through to the other side. I feel like it's kind of a tragedy when good people give up too soon, because they erroneously assume that, somehow if there's been a detour or an obstacle, that it's some kind of definitive thing that, oh, well, I guess this isn't going to work. The truth is, it might not work that way, but it doesn't mean it's not going to work. And I wanted to really provide the encouragement and a framework so that people could keep pushing through to get done what they need to get done.
Lovely. And diving in, Dorie, on this podcast, I spoke to a gentleman called Bill Carr, who's written the book Working Backwards, that talks about some of the practices at Amazon. And when I asked him about what makes Jeff Bezos special, one of the things he said was his ability to think over a longer time horizon than some of the others. And in the book, you refer to your insights from Martin Lindstrom, from working with one of the royal families, and Jonathan Brill, who speaks about profits over a decade scale. So talk to us a little bit about elongating the time horizon of our perspectives. How do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you, Deepak. I think that's exactly right, and certainly Jeff Bezos is a great example of this. I mean, one of the anecdotes that I also cite in The Long Game is he gave an interview about a decade ago with Wired magazine, and this is only accelerated in the decade since. But he said at the time that he thought that Amazon's secret of their success was that they were willing to invest on a 7-year cycle, whereas his competitors mostly would only do it on a 3-year cycle, meaning, that they would be willing to plow money into a project for up to 7 years before they see any returns, before they see any profits. And most companies just can't stomach that. But the fact that Amazon was willing to do it enabled them to tackle bigger and more meaningful projects that ultimately put a larger competitive moat between them and everyone else. And we see that with Amazon Web Services now. We see that with Prime and all of the initiatives that took a while sometimes to catch on, but now have become enormous drivers of revenue for them.
And back to specialization over time. In the book, you also refer to Francis Frey and Anna Morris, where they say choosing to be bad is your only shot at achieving greatness, and resisting it is a recipe for mediocrity. It was quite counterintuitive. I had to read it a couple of times to make sense of that statement. But I think one of the things I took away from that was you say that we need to be a little more definitive about saying no to middling opportunities that come our way, that ends up filling our calendar. So in your context, Dorie, as your practice has evolved, how have you sort of applied stage gates to saying no to things that come your way?
Yeah, this is a useful question, because nobody ever really makes it explicit that we need to change our criteria over time, that you need to tighten them over time. But if you fail to do it, it can really be crippling, because ultimately, it doesn't matter. When you're new in your career, it's not like there's this big queue of people wanting to meet with you. Like there's not. If one person wants to meet with you, it's like, yes, absolutely. But if you have that attitude 20 years into your career, it's going to be devastating, because what you get measured on is your ability to successfully complete the projects that you are conceiving and driving, not just, oh, well, can he take a bunch of meetings? Like that's not that helpful. So for me personally, things that I have done, I mean, I now need to have more of an agenda with people. I mean, if I think someone is just a genuinely interesting person, sometimes I will be glad to meet with them, not during my book launch, but in general, I love cultivating genuinely interesting people. But if there is some kind of a professional context, I mean, so often, this is sort of a trick that people pull. And I think sometimes they do it because they maybe don't know any better. And sometimes it's because they actually do want to obfuscate their real intentions. But they'll just say, oh, hey, Deepak, it would be really great to connect. When do you have 30 minutes on your calendar? And it's like, excuse me, did I miss something? Did you tell me what you want to take 30 minutes of my time for? And so I've just become very vigilant about, just at a very basic level, asking them, like, no, if you want 30 minutes, tell me what you want to talk about, so I can evaluate whether that's actually worth it or not, or if you just want to try to sell me insurance.
True.
So I'm curious for you, how do you handle this? You're a busy guy. How do you sort of draw the lines in terms of your own schedule and gatekeeping?
It's a good question, Dorie. In my previous firm, we used to have this metaphor of red men, amber men, and green men. When I say men, it's men or women. I'm sort of using that in a gender agnostic way. But they would say that, there are a bunch of people, thousands of people that are looking for your attention. Here's my brother's CV, here's my neighbor's sister's brother's CV kind of stuff, right? Try and meet the person. And you want to find a way of quickly blocking those if they're not value additive. Then you have amber, where people may not be immediately relevant, but like you said, interesting people, either they're good fun to hang out with, something you can learn, somebody you can learn something from, or somebody who could be relevant 2-3 years down the line. And then you have the green, where they are clients, they're influencers, you can learn something from them, etc., etc. So they would say, one of the things they would say is, before you meet somebody in person, ensure that you have a really high bar. It's easier to have a 5-minute phone call. You can't have a 5-minute meeting.
Yeah, that looks pretty bad, actually.
So one of the things we would say is try and have some sort of a frequent flyer program, right? You have a platinum, you have a gold, and you have a silver. And in your mind, be clear about what you're offering for silver. So if it's somebody who's amber, maybe you have some mass customized templates. So it doesn't eat your time, but you're still giving something of value to that individual. And if it's a red, then you just find a polite way of letting them know, being polite, but at the same time acknowledging that you've heard from them. So it's work in progress, Dorie, but that's at least roughly the perspective I work with.
I like it. I think that makes a world of good sense. So just out of curiosity, for those red people, give me an example, Deepak. Like what would you say so that they don't feel totally blown off? How would you extricate yourself?
It's a good question. I would say I have a lady who helps me with my calendar and some of the tasks. So I would say, thank you I would sort of try and, number one, I would sort of minimize the awkwardness and let her communicate and say, by the way, we've received your email. Thank you for your interest. And some silly reason, right? Typically, the kind of work I do doesn't fit with your profile, if I had to be candid, or currently going through a period of crunch, or I'm happy to connect you to A, B, or C. The one thing I try and do is, if somebody's looking for a resource rather than a no, you say, I'm not sure if I can help, but by the way, you might want to check this out. Or lastly, offer resources from the podcast. If somebody says, I'm in midlife and I want a sounding board, I say, going through a bandwidth crunch, but you might find this conversation with XYZ from the podcast helpful. So hopefully they're getting value from it anyway.
Clever. I like it. Yeah. So you're referring them to your pre-existing resources. Really good.
Right. So it's work in progress, but trying to learn here. Back to your book, Dorie. You refer to Paul Hersey's quote to Marshall Goldsmith, right? He was on the podcast as well a few months back. He says, "You're too successful. You're making too much money, and you're never going to be who you could be." How have you thought about this phrase and in the context of your journey and how you've evolved over time?
Yes. Well, you're picking some juicy quotes here. The context of this for folks who haven't read The Long Game is that Paul Hersey was Marshall Goldsmith's mentor. Marshall is today a very well known executive coach, and Paul Hersey was his kind of organizational development consulting mentor back when he was a younger man, and gave Marshall his first break. And the point that he was making is that if all your energy is around optimizing for revenue, in Marshall's case, he was young and he was making great money. So why would you not do that? That's wonderful up to a point, but ultimately most of us measure our life in different ways. It's not all about money. Money's great. We want plenty of money, but it becomes a problem if it's all about money. And what Paul was encouraging Marshall to turn to, and he did eventually turn to it, although in my interview in The Long Game, he says he regrets it took him too long. he was too jazzed about the money. But eventually he turned his attention a little bit to things that could actually help him leave a legacy. And, I'm not talking about leave a legacy like when you're 80, but I mean, creating intellectual property you can be proud of. What is it that you're putting out into the world that you get known for, that you get identified with? Because if all you're doing is client service, essentially, you might make good money, but you're not really making a mark on the discourse beyond the people that you're helping with your own two hands. And that's what Paul wanted for Marshall. And eventually Marshall did, of course, end up creating some wonderful and very lasting works. He's written a number of New York Times best-selling books like What Got You Here Won't Get You There and Triggers. He's created methodologies like his stakeholder-centered coaching. And that's actually in turn been able to help many, many more people. And he's been able to scale himself. But you really have to willfully make that choice.
And in a related context, Dorie, you talk about moving beyond trading time for dollars, right? As we think about both from an impact perspective, but also from a commercial lens. How have you thought about moving beyond trading time for dollars?
Well, this became an acute concern for me at the end of 2015 because my book Standout had been released and I decided I wanted to go all in on promoting it. And I did. And that year I ended up giving 74 talks, which was a lot of talks. And I was traveling for most of them. So I was on the road, at least every week, sometimes multiple times a week. And it was the end of the year. And I was sick. I had another cold and was just kind of feeling miserable and wondering, why am I doing this? This is so brutal. And the thought occurred to me, I had like a flu, but the thought occurred to me, wow, what if I got really sick? I couldn't do this. And that would be an even bigger problem because the speaking was a big part of my revenue. And so I realized that I needed to get smart about taking the steps so that I could protect myself and, protect the downside in case anything happened. Because there were two things that I thought might happen. I mean, one, I hope it doesn't, is that I would get sick. The other was that inevitably there would be some kind of a recession. And I thought, well, we all know how that works. Conferences are the first thing that gets cut. So they're not going to have me come speak. What I did not predict, notably, was a pandemic. And somehow I missed that. And the interesting thing, though, was that the same thing happened. By preparing for an eventuality where I couldn't travel or where conferences were canceled, that de facto enabled me to prepare for a world where there was a pandemic and everything was canceled. And so what I had done was really accelerate my foray into online courses. And that ended up being a saving grace, because for 2020, a massive number of talks that I had planned just got canceled and went away. And it could potentially have been very financially devastating for me. But amazingly, it actually turned into my most successful year ever financially, because I had been laying the groundwork for the preceding 5 or 6 years with online courses, and that ended up burgeoning during that time.
This is your host, Deepak Jayaraman. This has been something that's on my mind for the last few years. At least what I've told myself is that the advisory work I do is high touch, low reach. It probably makes a difference to 20-30 leaders a year. The podcast, however, is low touch, high reach. And hopefully it makes a difference to you, the listener, in reflecting on some of these themes and becoming a better version of yourself. The podcast is also something that I hope will outlive me when I'm gone. This is at least the goal I set for myself in terms of the nature of content I want to create. I came across something inspirational in one of my earlier conversations, in a place where I least expected. I was speaking to the stand-up comedian Atul Khatri, and we spent a lot of time on his transition from running an IT business to becoming a stand-up comedian. But along the way, he said something about the kind of content he wanted to create, something that stayed with me.
So I tend to not write very topical jokes, if you have a topical thing, so if you have to write about, about anything, like demonetization.
The shelf life becomes limited, right?
Yeah. So it's maximum, like people will remember it for like 4-5 months, even though it's a hot topic, people will remember 5. After that, people themselves say, please move on here. We've moved on, you moved on. Like in the COVID, now I'm sure when I go up on stage, I have not written one COVID joke. First of all, a lot of jokes are already there. And I don't know, because I think once you get out, you don't want to hear COVID. I think you're sick and tired of COVID. You've heard all the jokes. It's not a positive experience that you want to hear about it again. So I think, topicality I try to avoid. I always compare people like, the old Anand Bakshi lyrics or Kishore Kumar songs. Even today they sound so good because they were so well written, So I tell all comedians, write your every joke should be like an Anand Bakshi lyric, or a Kishore Kumar, like a song with some other, good, like, who were the other good lyricists, or Gulzar or Javed Akhtar or whatever. Write your songs write your material so that after 10 years also people should listen to it, laugh at that joke. And it should not get topical, it should still be fresh, it should still be maybe relevant or not relevant, it should still be funny.
I'm a big fan of Kishore Kumar too. When I'm creating my content, I find this as an interesting filter. I ask myself, is this a Kishore Kumar song that I'm trying to create? Or is it something like Kolaveri D or Gangnam Style that goes viral for a bit and then is forgotten forever? If you're enjoying the podcast, do take a moment to rate and review this podcast on Apple. As a matter of fact, Spotify recently added the functionality where people can rate and review a show if they've been listening to it regularly. This would really help us continue raising the bar on the podcast. Now, let's get back to the conversation with Dorie Clark. And in the book, you talk about 4 waves in becoming an expert in a certain field, Dorie. Could you talk about each of these? You talk about learning, creating, connecting, and reaping. Could you expand on these and how you've sort of thought about them at different stages?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the frameworks that I share in the long game actually comes as a result of some of the work that I've done with my own coaching clients, because people would often come to me and they would be feeling frustrated. They'd be feeling like they're in some kind of a rut, or that they were working really hard, but it didn't seem to be getting them anywhere. And what I saw time and again is if you peeled back the layers and talked to them about what they were doing, they definitely were working hard. That was true. But the problem was oftentimes they were working hard at the same thing. They were working hard at the thing that they were already good at, or the thing that they already knew how to do, or the thing that they already liked doing. And where they were falling short was transitioning into doing other things, necessary things. And so what I came to realize is that in our careers, we need to be mindful that we can't just get away with doing the same thing. We have to be aware of what wave we're in and then shift accordingly. And so the 4 that I identified, number 1 is the learning wave, because of course, when we're new at a company or we're new in a field, you have to take it all in. I mean, your whole life is, reading the books or listening to the podcasts or having the meetings so that you understand, who's who and how does this place work?
Right.
And you're soaking it up. But you obviously can't stay there. You have to make your own contribution at a certain point. And so you shift into creating mode. And that's where you're sharing your own ideas. And, there's a million ways you could do it. It's everything from speaking up in meetings to starting to offer your own advice. Hey, I can do a lunch and learn about X, Y, Z, or maybe it's mentoring other colleagues, or it's volunteering to present at a conference or whatever it is. But somehow you have to give back. You have to show people that you have ideas worth listening to. There also then needs to be the connecting phase, because your ideas, however good they are not going to be very successful, or they're not going to get a lot of traction if you're the only one that knows about them. You have to build relationships and build connections so that they can get amplified. And then finally, we get to the reaping phase, which sounds good, but that is what we were talking about earlier with Marshall Goldsmith. It is good. It's wonderful to be successful and respected and making a lot of money, but it's not good if you stay there and you stagnate, and it prevents you, the kind of golden handcuffs preventing you from making your full contribution, which is why we need to cycle back at a certain point into learning mode.
I think one of the other guests was a lady called Whitney Johnson, who talks about these multiple S curves, and she talks about the same thing. How do you really, we all go through these phases in an S curve, and then you need to know when you're tapering off and then pick the next S curve and so on and so forth.
Absolutely, yeah.
The other theme that struck me, Dorie, was you talk about different kinds of relationships, right? How we think about them. You talk about the short-term, long-term, and what you call infinite horizon networking. I think all of us know short-term is not good. Very often we settle into the long-term. Could you tease out the nuance between long-term and infinite horizon the way you see it?
Yeah. So the way that I think about networking in this way, long-term networking is great. That's what most successful networkers, most successful professionals do. And that is building relationships with people where it's not like you need a particular thing. I mean, as you said, we know that that's kind of sleazy. Oh, I wonder if I can get him to talk to me so he can invest or whatever. We don't want that. When you're doing long-term networking, it's just, hey, I respect this person. They're in my orbit. I should get to know them. They seem cool. I don't know what they can do for me. They can probably do something for me at some point. I don't know what. I can probably do something for them at some point. Let's see. It's a great attitude. But the challenge that I feel like even a lot of really good networkers fall down in is they often fail to build relationships with people that seem irrelevant to them for obvious reasons, because they seem irrelevant. But the truth is, some of the most transformative relationships that you can have are the ones that are out of left field, that seem completely random, because those are the ones that can genuinely expose you to new ideas, to new information, to new opportunities, and actually can really profoundly at times change the way you think about things. And that's, to me, is infinite horizon. And it gets overlooked, but it's very powerful.
And maybe if I could stick with that, Dorie, how do you? What's the filter? Back to the metaphor of red men or red women, and somebody who could be a potentially valuable person, let's say, as from an infinite horizon perspective. Any markers you look for you to say maybe I should lean into this relationship?
I think the most important one is just, are they interesting? Are they somebody that you love talking about, you love learning from? There should not necessarily be any kind of, direct professional benefit. Who knows? Who cares? But for me, it's, would they be an interesting, dinner guest? If you invited them to a dinner, would you be happy they were there talking to them? And would your guests, there's a guy who's in my recognized expert community, and he's a former FBI hostage negotiator. And I feel like I would invite him to any dinner party. He's always going to be a winner at the dinner party because people are going to love talking to Chip. And that's, that's something that is really cool. Like, I'm not sure exactly what that can quote unquote get you necessarily.
Of course.
Maybe something, maybe nothing, who knows, but he's always going to be interesting. And that applies for almost anything, even if it's far reaching. I mean, I'd love to talk to a professional polo player. I mean, like random, but cool.
Got it. Leaning into curiosity and sort of, one of the inspirations for my podcast was this book called The Curious Mind by Brian Grazer, a Hollywood producer who's made Beautiful Mind. And he talks about something similar. He says, I used to meet a range of people across disciplines, and somehow the plot evolves, and I make a movie and something comes out of it. So, point well taken. Changing tracks completely, Dorie. You also have done quite a bit of thinking around pricing in the context of, value-based pricing or results-based pricing. And that's something I end up thinking about, right? I think in the profession I'm in, often there's a temptation to go with the opportunity cost of my time. That's sort of one frame. But I find it helpful to frame it as, participation and value creation in my work with a client. What are some of the things you've learned about pricing for value, if I may frame it that way?
Yeah. Well, it's an important question because early on when people are working for themselves, this is often the touchiest issue. This is the part where even seasoned professionals get really nervous. Number one, because usually we're at an informational disadvantage. A client, might put out some kind of an RFP and, they see 10 consultants, they see 20, they know all about everybody's pricing. You most likely don't know about anybody's. And so you're kind of shooting in the dark, which is why I think it's so important oftentimes, especially early on, but I think in general, to just, really invest in building a robust professional community for yourself. Because people often say, oh, well, why do I need to know other consultants or, whatever your field is? I just want to talk to clients. I just want to talk to potential customers. Well, that's great up until the moment when you actually have to generate business. And then you need people where you can say, well, what if they did this? What if they said that? How should I structure this? So I do think that's really important. But to your point about value-based pricing, which, of course, are a requisite hat tip to Alan Weiss, who really is a master at this and wrote an entire book about value-based fees. It is really useful to understand that the pricing that you're doing, it is completely appropriate to understand that, number one, you have to learn to ask smart questions so that you can understand what the value actually is over time. That's the first piece. It's not always self-evident either to you or necessarily to the client. So you have to ask the right questions to elucidate it and understand it. But once you do, you're framing it and, they might have sticker shock and, oh, well, I was used to paying $50 an hour. Why is this more than $50 an hour? Well, who cares if it's $1,050 an hour or whatever it comes out to, if they're going to make millions of dollars. But you have to show them, you have to help them understand that frame, that it's not about, oh, it's so inappropriate to pay a person this amount of money. They shouldn't care if the value is high enough. And it's really about shining a light and helping articulate that.
And Marshall talks about that. I think he's done a lot of thinking as well, I understand, on how do you sort of, and he also talks a little bit about not charging a fee upfront, but really saying, you pay me on success. Have you, on that note, have you experimented with something that's sort of out of the box, where you've been surprised by the outcomes in the way you think about value-based pricing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have not done that particular model about your money back, essentially, if it doesn't work, or don't pay me until it succeeds. But I do love it in terms of just a strong brand promise. I mean, from a marketing perspective, boom, that really crystallizes things. It's a very high fee, but nonetheless, people can say, well, it's because, it puts it all in context. Yes, it's a very high fee, but wow, it would really be worth it if it works. And if I only have to pay it if it works, well, then that actually seems like a very reasonable bet. So I think there's real power in that. I'm actually thinking about, in terms of, this is not about pricing per se, but I'm thinking about this right now because I'm getting ready to, in the next month or so, do a new launch of my Recognized Expert community. And typically, I've had a sort of system that I've used for a while about, okay, well, these emails at this date, and then it leads up to a webinar and things like that. And I'm actually wondering, like, maybe this is the time to experiment and do things just a little bit differently. And so I'm thinking through right now, if I have it look different, I think I might not necessarily do a webinar like I typically do. I think I might try something. And this is literally in process. I'm trying to figure it out. I'm wondering, maybe I'll just do an email series, or maybe I'll have something where it's like, not necessarily a webinar, but like, hey, just call me if you have questions, and I'll be like manning the phone. I don't know. I'm playing around with it, but I think this might be a good time to experiment.
Fascinating. The other theme I'm curious about, Dorie, is a term that I picked up from James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, who was on this book on this podcast as well. He uses this phrase, plateau of latent potential, where he says often there's a time delay between us starting something and us sort of seeing the green shoots. Even in your case, you say there's a 5-year delay between somebody prodding you to write the book and you actually writing it. At the same time, you go on to say that very often, the question in my head is, how do you know you're climbing the wrong tree versus persisting with the climb? And you talk about some raindrops that often give you some sort of guidance that you're probably on the right path. Can you talk a little bit about this phenomenon?
Yeah, definitely. So what I often will tell my clients when they do get discouraged sometimes, because we all want it faster, it would be great. When I in the book, I talk about strategic patience, and strategic patience is kind of my antidote to regular patience, which I just don't really like at all because it seems so passive. But for strategic patience, you understand that things are going to take longer than you want. You don't necessarily like it. You don't have to like it, but it might take longer than you want. But you're doing things, you're taking action, you're coming up with hypotheses, you're testing things, you're adjusting it. You're not just like waiting, like, oh, maybe something will happen, right? And so waiting for the raindrops and looking for the raindrops is really powerful, because I think where a lot of people go wrong is they get so fixated on the final outcome, which in our metaphor here, we can call the thunderstorm. And that's like, oh, well, it's a New York Times bestseller. Or, oh, well, you get to be the keynote speaker at the huge conference. Those things really take a while. And it's very easy for us, if that's all we're fixated on, to sort of talk down or to negate some of the smaller victories. It's like, you start to, you go from nowhere, and then you start to get invited on a couple of podcasts. Well, but nobody listens to those podcasts. Yeah, but, okay, it doesn't have to be Oprah. It's that you went from nobody knowing who you were to a couple of random people knowing who you are. That's actually progress. Like, I know you want it to be bigger and faster and better, but to understand that to have anybody calling you up and asking you to be on their show, that is a victory. And we need to understand it as such and not get snooty about it, but instead to really appreciate, okay, this is what it looks like to make progress. This is what it looks like to be getting there. I think that's powerful.
It's a great point. It's a great point. Sort of being realistic about what the baby steps look like in terms of outcomes and market recognition and sort of marching on. Got it. This is your host Deepak Jayaraman here. Whenever we change trajectories, it's critical for us to rethink metrics of progress. And sometimes this can be hard. I find that we can often fall into the trap of measuring our progress in the currency of the world we used to operate in, but we need to be cognizant of what we are solving for and proactively reset some of the metrics. One of my earlier speakers, Whitney Johnson, has used some of the principles of Clay Christensen to illustrate this when we jump from one S-curve to another.
And so whenever you step back or you jump to a new S-curve, it's really important to rethink the metrics. That's inside of your career. And certainly for anybody who is making the decision to become an entrepreneur or making the decision to leave the workforce and retire and to go run a nonprofit. Like if you continue to use the metric of how much money am I making and you're running a nonprofit, you are going to fail every single day of your life. But that's because it's the wrong metric. And so when we're stepping back to slingshot forward, in order for us to be able to be successful, we need to make sure that we're using the right metrics to measure our progress.
And could you maybe illustrate with a couple of examples on what's the kind of shift that we need in the metrics, just for people to get a realistic sense on what the traps could be, and therefore how we should, what's the language around how we rethink the metrics?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the ways that we can do this is to say to ourselves, I remember when I was writing this book, I came across a gentleman who was telling me about how he had been on one S-curve and he was an executive inside of a company. And so the metrics he was using were things like, are we generating revenue? Are we expanding margins? Typical things that you would look at from a P&L perspective when you're running a business. He now retires and decides to become, be a grandfather full time. Well, he's on a brand new S-curve. The tendency is when we jump to a brand new S-curve is to use the same metrics that we used before because it's become part of our wiring. But if this gentleman every day was waking up and saying, how much revenue have I generated today? Have I expanded margins? Because that's what he's now wired to do. That's what he's in the habit of doing. Every single morning, he was going to feel like he was ineffective. The metric had to shift to, how present am I for my grandchildren today? Did I take them to the park? Did they discover something that made them feel full of wonder and curiosity? Was I able to be present during that time? I'll give you an even simpler example because I think this is to drill down on this idea. I have a checklist every day that I use, sort of 10 things that I want to accomplish every day. So, I want to run today. I'm going to read some type of spiritual sacred text. I have a list of 4 things I'm going to accomplish. I'm going to, things that I'm going to do every day. Well, one of the things I discovered is that is a great checklist for me Monday through Saturday. But Sunday, I want it to be a day of rest. I want it to be a day of worship. And one of the things that I was finding that was very frustrating for me is that I was carrying over my checklist from Monday through Saturday to Sunday. So I was getting really frustrated because I was thinking, well, I'm measuring myself by this checklist that I'm using the other 6 days. And so what I had to start doing was create a new checklist for Sunday. Things like, did I go to church today? Did I spend time with my family? Did I do family history? Did I write in my journal? Totally different checklist. And so that's what I mean is when you look at the S-curve that you've decided to jump to, whether it's in your personal or your professional life, the metrics you use, make sure that is measuring what you want to measure so that you'll know if in fact you're successful and not measuring yourself against metrics that actually aren't relevant and just lead to frustration and a feeling that you're on the wrong S-curve. So one quick quote around that I love, and I think this is important. It's from Liz Strauss. She says, "It's not possible for the world to hold a meeting to decide your value. That decision is yours." And that's where these idea of metrics come in. You have to decide what metrics you're going to use to decide your value.
I love what Whitney says here. The world is not going to hold a meeting to decide your value. That decision is yours. And unless we set up our own bespoke balanced scorecard, we are likely to solve for metrics that others set for us. And more often than not, that's not a sustainable recipe. If you're enjoying the podcast, do take a moment to rate and review this podcast on Apple or Spotify. Actually, Spotify recently introduced a feature where you can rate and review a show. That would really help us continue raising the bar on the podcast. Now, let's get back to Dorie Clark. In your journey, Dorie, how have you thought about, you talk about modalities. How have you thought about the architectural choice, right? Is it one or two things or a portfolio of things in the way you've approached your journey? I find that's often before we decide what we want to do, figuring out the architecture. Is it one thing? Is it 10 things or 2 things is often a choice. How have you thought about that?
Yeah, this is a really good point. I am a big believer, and one of the drums that I like to beat, in 20% time, which is a concept I have borrowed from Google. They have made it famous. The idea is that their employees are allowed, sometimes even encouraged, to spend up to 20% of their time working on discretionary, kind of experimental projects outside the scope of their job. And this is something that I heartily believe that everyone should do. Now, the trick is no one's going to hand it to you, right? It's always easier to just, we'll just answer those extra emails or something like that. But we need to carve it out. We need to be decisive about doing it. But if we do, I think it's an incredibly powerful exercise, because you don't want to diversify so much so that you're not making progress on anything, that you're, moving, a million things an inch. That's not very helpful. But also, you put yourself at strategic risk if all you're doing is one thing, if all you know about is one thing. And so I think 20% time is actually a really powerful balance, because if your 20% time project for some reason blows up, it doesn't go anywhere, it's a big failure, well, it's unfortunate, but you're not going to go bankrupt. Your life is not going to be ruined because you wasted 20% of your time, right? It's not that big of a deal. Whereas if you actually invest that time, and let's say it's a positive outcome, if it actually turns into something, 20% of your time, if you spend it, enough months or enough years working on it, you can actually legitimately really get somewhere with that. It's enough of a bet that you can make progress. And so I think that it's a very good compromise as a way to think about exploring new possibilities.
And you work with people from different fields in your recognized expert community and otherwise. Any examples to bring this to life, the kinds of things people have done in the 20%, just to provoke a reflection?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in terms of 20% time, I mean, one that I will selfishly highlight, there's a great woman in the community named Marie Contreras, who is a social media consultant, and she books people for TEDx talks and things like that. But her original training, and this is in fact what she was doing when I first met her, was as a jazz musician. And so I have recruited her into the world of musical theater, which is an interest of mine. She had never done musical theater. She'd only done jazz and opera and classical, but I bullied her into getting into musical theater, essentially. And we are now working together on several musical theater projects. I'm proud to say we, a couple of weeks ago, got accepted into a new fellowship program by the Prospect Theater Company in New York. And in mid-November, there's going to be a showcase at Symphony Space in New York, and a 10-minute musical that we're writing will be produced there.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's very fun, and I'm pleased to be spending my 20% time doing that.
Lovely. And moving forward, Dorie, you talk about back to time horizons once again, right? You say that if we operate with a 3-year perspective, there are many competitors, but if we take a 7 or a 10-year view, then the number of competitors we see drops significantly. How have you experienced this in your journey and in some of the people that you coached?
Yeah. Well, ultimately, we need to have some kind of direction, some kind of flag that we're planting. And what I've seen is that a lot of people are actually very hesitant to articulate, and sometimes even to just form for themselves long-term goals, because they feel like somehow they're not entitled to do it because they don't know how they would achieve it. I can't possibly do blah, blah, blah. I wouldn't know where to start. I wouldn't know how to do that. Well, the great news, the great thing about a truly long-term goal is, of course, you don't know. It would be almost preposterous for you to have this 20-year goal and be like, oh, I know exactly how I'm going to fulfill that. The world is going to be so different in 20 years. No, you don't. You just really cannot predict. Our political systems can be different. Half the world can be underwater. I don't even know. But it's going to look different in 20 years. And so we don't need to understand how we're going to do something. All we need is the long-term vision, just something we want to do, something we're interested in. Guess what? It can also change, incidentally. So it's not like you're locking yourself in forever, but you need to know that long-term goal and you need to know the first step. That's it. And you will learn more in taking that first step that enables you to figure out what the second step is. And you just keep going from there.
Got it. This is your host, Deepak Jayaraman here. Building on what Dorie says, I do think there are 2 or 3 strands to this that I'm beginning to appreciate in my journey. First, I'm realizing that most natural systems in life cannot be rushed and have a natural clock of their own. I noticed that the compounding curve is a lot more prevalent than I thought. Whether it's building trust with the people around, building capability, developing speed as a guitar player, or improving my pace while running, I noticed that the gains often come in the tail end and are non-linear. For instance, if I have to play a piece of melody at a tempo of 150 in a week, I realize that if I can get comfortable with it at a tempo of 75 to 100 over 4 or 5 days, then moving from 100 to 150 happens quickly in a day or 2. I feel a similar principle applies to some of the other spaces as well, where the returns compound and are visible in the tail end. The second piece here is that I've started focusing more and more on input metrics than output metrics. Initially, when I started doing the podcast, I would sweat over the number of clicks, repeat visits, etc. But over time, I realized that I was losing my focus on creating good quality content and slowly changed my attention to the quality of the content I'm creating. At some level, like most things in life, this has been covered by Bhagavad Gita. Amish Tripathi, my very second guest, brought it to my attention in the context of how he's approached his writing.
When I write, I don't really care. Even now, when I write, I'm not really thinking about how it will be received by readers, critics, publishers, or anyone else, frankly. This is how I wrote my first book, and this is how I write today as well. I can't say it was a conscious choice when I was writing my first book, because I wasn't even really thinking that it would get published. I guess without realizing it, I was following what Lord Krishna tells us in the Bhagavad Gita, Karmani vadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana, that you have a right to your karma, not to the fruits of your karma. And we in the modern world have interpreted this wonderful philosophy to mean something fatalistic, which is not what Lord Krishna was telling us. What he was telling us is actually, if you are detached from the results of your karma, if you are detached from success or failure, then actually you are unstoppable. If you are doing something simply because you love doing it, simply because you enjoy your karma so much, who can stop you? Because failure can of course be demotivating, because it feels sadness, grief, demotivation in your heart, and it stops you. Sure. But success can be as dangerous, because you'll find so many people who are one-hit wonders, because success fills pride in their head and they lose their way. But if you're detached from success or failure, then actually you're unstoppable, because you'll just keep doing what you love doing.
The third piece I feel is around keeping the focus on systems rather than goals. One of my guests, James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, spoke about this quite clearly. He says that we don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems.
That phrase, we do not rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. What I'm really trying to get at with that is the distinction between our desired outcomes and our daily habits. Because a lot of the time, whether it's an individual or an organization that I work with, when they want to change their behavior, they often start by trying to set a larger goal. Let's double revenue this quarter, or I want to lose a certain amount of weight in the next 3 months, or whatever it is. And we think, well, if I just have bigger goals, if I try to take massive action, then I'll get these massive results. But the truth is, the goal is actually the easy part, and it's also fairly common among people in your particular industry to have the same goals. Like if 100 people apply for a job, presumably every candidate has the goal of getting the job. Or if 30 teams compete in the league for the same championship, presumably every team has the goal of winning the championship. And so if the winners and the losers in that domain have the same goals, the goal cannot be the thing that makes the difference. And that doesn't mean that goals are useless. Goals can be useful for setting a sense of direction, developing clarity, understanding where you want to focus. But once you understand that, once you understand where you want to allocate your attention and energy, it's useful to sort of put the goal on the shelf, philosophically speaking, and focus almost exclusively on the system. And I would define the system as the collection of daily habits that you follow and take you toward a particular goal. So ultimately, what we're looking for, of course, is to align the desired outcome, the goal, with your daily habits, the system. But whether you have the goal or not, and this is why I think it's so useful to focus on the system, your habits will carry you to a place, whether you want them to or not, right? And so I think, like, for example, a useful question to ask yourself is, can my current habits carry me to my desired future? And what you find is that a lot of the time they cannot. If you just keep repeating the same habits that you have today, will you end up where you want to end up? And what that is getting at, what that is showing you, is how much more powerful the system is than the goal. Whenever a system runs, it inevitably moves towards some destination. And what you want is to make sure that that destination is aligned with this system that you have, that your desired outcome and your daily habits are in alignment. But if they're not, the goal is not the thing that wins. If there's a difference between the system and the goal, the system always wins.
Personally, I've started focusing more and more on direction than distance milestones. And that's been quite a liberation in terms of enjoying the journey that one's pursuing. Now, let's get back to the conversation with Dorie Clark. It's changing tracks, Dorie. One of the themes that I explore in this podcast is authenticity and what it means to different people. In the book, The Long Game, you've openly spoken about being part of the LGBTQ community. Can you talk a little bit about how you've thought about authenticity at different points in your journey?
Yeah, thank you. Well, ultimately, ever since I was a teenager and I came out, I just was never interested in trying to hide anything or to sort of contort my personality in some way. And I really am a big believer that other people generally take their cues from you. It is a very small percentage, a tiny percentage of people that are so hostile or so hateful to, whatever, whether it's your religion or your race or your sexuality or whatever. It's a very small percentage of people that are going to be aggressive towards you just because. But I really think that for the vast majority of people, they are looking to you for guidance about how you should be treated. And for me, it is really important to just be myself and be comfortable and be confident, because in doing that, it's showing other people, okay, good. Well, great. Let's be normal. Let's be comfortable together. And I think that when we come at people from a friendly and open position where it's, I don't have anything to hide, it's of course it's perfectly normal to, talk about a girlfriend rather than a boyfriend or whatever. If you make it not a big deal, it's not going to be a big deal. And that's the world that I would rather live in. I don't think that we need to make things a big issue. And I also think we don't need to be cowering in the corner, worried about what other people think. I think that we have actually a lot more power than we imagine to influence the discourse and to influence our relationships. And so what I try to do as best I can is hopefully be helpful to other people in the future by just setting a framework and expectations that, no big deal. This is nothing to notice, nothing to worry about. Let's just get on with business and being friends.
Lovely. I love the way you frame it. They look to you for cues for how they want to treat you. It's a wonderful way of framing it. Dorie, this podcast is titled Play to Potential. And one of the themes, as we wrap up, I explored with all the people who come on the podcast is what that phrase means to them. What does the phrase playing to potential mean to you?
Well, I like it very much. I think it's a good title, Deepak. I like it because ultimately, yeah, I mean, that is really what we're all striving for. I mean, I immediately think about self-actualization and Abraham Maslow, that we all are able to achieve a certain amount. And it's true, because sometimes of poor choices or because sometimes holding ourselves back, we don't always get there. And I think that's a real loss for society. I think if we could find a way to enable everyone to tap into their abilities and enable them to contribute at that full level, we really would be able to make so much more progress and be closer to living in the world that we all want to live in. So I commend you for raising the bar and encouraging people to meet and exceed it.
Lovely, Dorie. Thank you so much for making the time and for your insights.
Thank you, Deepak. It's so great to have the opportunity. And I'll actually just mention for any of your listeners who are interested in applying the concepts of strategic thinking to their own lives and their own careers, I do have a free resource that folks can get, which is the Long Game Strategic Thinking Self-Assessment. Mm-hmm. And you can get it for free at dorieclark.com/thelonggame.
Lovely. And I'll put that in the show notes as well. So thank you so much, Dorie, for your time. Thank you for listening. I hope you found the conversation purposeful. A couple of messages before we wrap up. Do rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you consume the content. I noticed that Spotify also recently introduced a feature where regular listeners can rate a show. It might seem like a repetitive ask, but trust me, it makes a big difference in people discovering this podcast amidst a lot of noise out there. And it helps us attract good quality guests that look at these kind of metrics. If you're interested in receiving short 2 or 3 minutes extracts of wisdom from the podcast, served up once or twice a week, do consider signing up by sending a WhatsApp message at +91 85914 52129. I repeat, it's +91 85914 52129. Here we share short extracts from across the various guests we have at the podcast archives. To know more about what's in the archives and the advisory work I do, you could just visit playtopotential.com. That's PLAYTOPOTENTIAL.com. Thank you, and hope to have you tune into one of the subsequent conversations at the podcast. Bye now.